Today, we'll be discussing the smallpox vaccine hesitancy through the lens of communication and media. First, I'll begin with the origin of smallpox outbreaks. The first written documentation of the disease dates back to the 4th century Common Era CE in China. This information was communicated to future populations that dealt with smallpox through this written documentation. These populations could then concur that when smallpox did appear again, that it was not a new disease. They knew that it was simply a reoccurrence through the written documentation of the symptoms and progression of smallpox. Historically, smallpox has been spread as civilizations grow and expand, and this has happened in several different intervals throughout human history as explorers traveled to lands that had not previously been exposed to the virus. With continued communication and interaction between populations from different areas, people in regions that had not been around diseases that had been in Europe, Asia, and the Middle East previously were hit particularly hard. For example, in the 11th century with the Catholic Crusades, smallpox was spread further throughout Europe. And in the 17th century, European settlers brought smallpox to North America. So now discussing the science of smallpox. Smallpox has been around for roughly 3,000 years. The origin is unknown. However, there have been findings on Egyptian mummies that are believed to be smallpox-like rashes. Symptoms include a high fever, fatigue, headaches, and backaches. The initial incubation period for the virus is about 12 days, but it can vary anywhere from 7 to 19. After the incubation period, a flat red rash will appear beginning on the face and then spread throughout the body. Over 2 to 3 weeks, the rash will become inflated, fill with pus, and scab over. After about 3 to 4 weeks, the scab will then fall off and leave scars that are referred to as pitted. Smallpox is an extremely contagious infection that is spread by the variola virus. It can be spread from person to person through sneezing, coughing, or breathing. Additionally, it can be spread through contact with the rash or scab of a person who does have smallpox.
In this graphic below, we can see that one of the major modes of communication through history is through religion. Several cultures had gods and goddesses that they believed either caused or cured smallpox, and this contributed to the spread of ideas and information about smallpox. Another significant part of smallpox history is the smallpox epidemic that took place in the 16th century. Lacking immunity to Old World pathogens carried by the Spanish, indigenous inhabitants of Central America and the Caribbean fell victim to terrible plagues of smallpox, influenza, and other viruses. The image presented below, the 16th century, is drawn in the Florentine Codex, which is a document written by a 16th century Spanish friar, which documents the death of nearly half the Aztec population. This type of communication is really useful because it provides records that allow us to understand the past better.
In the earlier days of smallpox, in the absence of formal media outlets and organizations, stories of disease and immunity were mainly spread by people traveling and telling stories about how things were in other places. This left a lot of room for interpretation and bias in the spread of information, as scientific knowledge was not always at the forefront of the conversation. For example, in the Ottoman Empire in the 1700s, there was a large informal network of female medical professionals who discovered a way to give healthy people a small amount of the infection and make them immune to future disease. It's interesting to note that although this practice, called variolation or inoculation, was ubiquitous in the informal network of women health workers, it was completely absent from writings done by male doctors at the time. It was well known in Europe that inoculation was taking place in other regions, but European countries were very resistant to adopting the practice. Part of this was due to xenophobia and sexism. European doctors refused to believe that the Ottomans had a solution, and worse, that it came from women. This is Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was married to a rich and influential man in England, which gave her a decent amount of social capital. She traveled to the Ottoman Empire in 1717 and saw the effectiveness of inoculation firsthand, and began campaigning for it when she returned to London. Lady Mary tried to convince the Princess of Wales to inoculate her children, and thereby making inoculation a political matter. Those who opposed the royal family opposed inoculation because of its association with the royal family. There was also opposition because of mistrust for Islam and the fact that inoculation came from an Islamic area. This shows how, during this time period, the people providing the information were arguably more important than the actual information they were providing. So the only reason that this process of inoculation received any consideration in England was because Lady Montagu had enough social capital to be relevant. Those with fewer connections or those belonging to certain cultural or religious groups had no voice at all, despite their experiences.
Around the same time, the first instances of known inoculation was taking place in the Americas. This was through an enslaved African man named Wenceslaus. He showed his enslaver, Cotton Mather, who was a Puritan minister who was heavily active in the church and also in the Salem witch trials, how to protect himself and others from smallpox. He did this by showing him his arm-to-arm inoculation that was done in 1760, which was done through the cowpox pus. Upon learning this, Mather became more educated, looking at the history of inoculation in Africa and also in the Ottoman Empire, and wanted to advocate for vaccination/inoculation for the whole Boston community where they were located. When the 1721 epidemic started, Mather and Dr. Bolston vaccinated everyone they could, including enslaved workers and their families, which reduced the rate of death significantly for those workers and their family to 1 in 40 versus the 1 in 7 that was common in Boston at the time. So there was a lot of pushback against this at the time. The clergy argued that it was against God's will to expose people to dangerous diseases, and there was a lot of xenophobia. They didn't trust that medical procedures associated with enslaved people, especially Black people, should be or could be applied to them for the general public. There was it came to the point where Mather actually had a bomb thrown into his house. Regardless, after the 1721 epidemic, just by looking at how efficient it was, it definitely helped later causes for vaccination.
So now a little bit about the background on the smallpox vaccine. The smallpox vaccine was developed as a safer method of staying safe from smallpox after variolation became more widespread. Variolation, though effective, was full of risk and was more deadly than a vaccine would be. This made vaccination a slightly safer format, but it was not accepted around the world initially due to cultural differences. In 1796, Dr. Edward Jenner noticed that milkmaids who had caught cowpox from the cows they worked with often encountered cowpox once, but they did not get it again. And then this illness that they had caught prevented them from getting smallpox in the future. He took material from the cowpox sore on a milkmaid's arm and put it to the arms of other individuals. Shortly after this, the vaccine was developed from the less deadly cowpox protected individuals from smallpox. Through discussion and communication of the positives of the smallpox vaccine over variolation throughout the community, the vaccine eventually became the favored format of preventing death from smallpox.
The vaccination arrived in New England in 1800 and was immediately embraced by Thomas Jefferson. And starting with Massachusetts in 1809, there were many states who enacted mandatory vaccination laws. Despite this, vaccination was hard to enforce. There was active pushback from a small minority of citizens who didn't trust government, science, or medicine. This changed, however, in 1905 in the landmark Supreme Court case called Jacobson versus Massachusetts. Jacobson argued that mandatory vaccines violated his personal liberty. The state argued that the entire public health was at risk, and the Supreme Court ruled that the welfare of the whole triumphed the rights of the individual, and sided with Massachusetts. Therefore, from that point on, states were able to mandate vaccines and actually enforce that mandation. In the graph above, we can see when vaccines were introduced in 1800, in Boston, the cases went down, the death rate went down like significantly. So in cities that were very hit by the virus, it was a lot easier to get people on the side of vaccination. However, in places where it was dying down, it was a little bit harder. Until the 1900s, there was not very much formal media about smallpox, at least in the Americas. In the 1800s, the vaccination of smallpox became widespread over the course of a century. And in 1959, the WHO began a campaign to get rid of smallpox throughout the world through mass vaccinations. Before that, in 1912, many schools required smallpox vaccinations before kids could attend. And in the 1920s, during that whole decade, there was actually vaccination days as well.
So a little bit about why schools were a good place for vaccinations to occur was that the schools were experts at communicating with the public and with parents about the benefit. In the 1920s, as mentioned previously, many schools vaccinated children for smallpox during the school day, and parents were informed and approved of this prior to the day. So children were lined up in the cafeteria and given the smallpox vaccine. The schools communicated benefits of the vaccine with the parents, and the majority to all parents had their children vaccinated. At the time, there was less speculation about the potential or non-existent effects of the vaccine. To many parents, the worry of death of their child outweighed the potential effects of the vaccine. Again, schools were an ideal and still are an ideal place to distribute and deliver large-scale vaccinations due to their experience in dealing with the community.
So now we're going to compare smallpox outbreaks throughout history to the current COVID-19 pandemic. As mentioned before, the involvement of the royal family in the discussion around inoculation made it a political issue in England in the 1700s. This is similar to the current COVID pandemic because perceptions of the pandemic are very divided based on political affiliation. During the smallpox outbreak in London, there was also opposition because of mistrust for Islam. And then in the United States, people mistrusted inoculation because the information came from Black people. In COVID, we see that people associate the coronavirus with China, which has led to mistreatment and distrust of China and Chinese people, and has even stirred racially charged conspiracy theories. Another similarity between smallpox and COVID is the use of personal liberties as an argument to oppose COVID-19 regulations, and also in the past, mandatory smallpox vaccinations. All of these are examples of how information and distrust are communicated and spread throughout the population. During the smallpox outbreaks, information was spread through word of mouth, and those with the most social capital were the ones who were most often listened to. This is similar to COVID because there's a lot of misinformation and disinformation, and the reputation of the person providing the information outweighs the legitimacy of the actual information in some cases. Another similarity between smallpox and COVID is the struggle to vaccinate large groups of people. However, with COVID, we see a lot of collaboration and cooperation between countries, which has significantly increased the rate of vaccine development. With COVID, there is also a lot more information available, and the spread of information is much more rapid. We now have access to news from across the globe and so many different perspectives on the same events, depending on where you choose to get your news and information. This contributes to the polarization of opinions on the pandemic. We can learn a lot about the spread of information and public perception from smallpox. And although some of the issues we face in the COVID pandemic are unique due to specific cultural and technological advancements, there still exist many similarities in the way we as humans perceive and share information. So I think that by continuing to look at the past and how these issues have come about in previous pandemics and epidemics, we can have a better understanding of how we ought to move into the future. Here are our sources, and thank you so much for watching.